In this video, I look to examine the effects of dual nationality and conflicting regional identities in the context of sociability and leisure, particular focus on travel and the aspects of foreign culture that people with multiple identities look for when they're abroad. I chose to interview my parents. My father, who has an English-Irish background and in his 20s spent a considerable amount of time in the former Soviet Union, and my mother, whose parents' professions forced her to regularly move around England as a child, in order to gain further insight into what is important for people with multiple identities when they're abroad. And why. I began by asking them to define their national identities.
Well, I think that I was English or British rather than anything else. But a national identity doesn't particularly have, a really strong meaning for me in the wider scheme of things. I'd rather feel that I'm a citizen of the world than of any particular country. I feel that quite strongly.
And I would say then British, but when I think about it, more Irish to some extent as well. But like Mum, it's not really something that the major defining thing in how you think of yourself.
Do you think that reluctance could have something to do with the negative connotations of certainly how people around the world would perceive English people due to colonialism?
Yeah, well, I think British is a more neutral term, and English is a more loaded term because it means kind of privileging being English over being British. So that's a colonialist attitude of superiority within the United Kingdom or within Great Britain already. So it's less something you'd want to identify with.
And I think actually growing up, I think definitely we would have used the word English to mean British without even thinking about it, without thinking that it was a loaded thing to do.
Yeah.
Just to say, with writers and so forth, even connect as far as Irish writers. A lot of Irish writers I used to think were English and used to use the word English without thinking about it, without thinking about that kind of way it might be loaded, just because that was kind of the norm that I was brought up with.
Was that the rhetoric of the time, or was that just...
Yeah, definitely, because there wasn't nearly so much awareness about discriminating between Englishness, Scottishness and Welshness amongst the English. They just kind of had this assumption English was what we were.
When you were growing up, was the Irish side of your ethnic makeup promoted at home, or were you made to feel it at school by your peers?
Well, when I was at home a bit, but not aggressively. When I was in primary school, because it was a Catholic primary school, there were a lot of kids from families with an Irish background, along with kids from an Italian or Polish background as well. So it wasn't something that stood out. It seemed quite a normal thing. Then when I went to secondary school, that was an environment where you just kind of felt you wanted to be what was normal, and so it wasn't having Irish roots wasn't really something that was a prominent thing at that stage of my life. It was something I got more tuned into when I was a bit older.
When you were playing something like cricket when you were at secondary school, would you say that kind of would have taken away from your Irish side?
Yeah, the thing about sport is that you just would have always identified with England in sports. But that was the culture. That's the culture you grew up in. That's something that's quite ingrained. And when I think about it, it seems a bit bizarre that I'd always support England in sports.
Yeah.
But it's just something. It's a reflex. It's very ingrained.
Did moving around a lot as a child influence your sense of regional national identity, or just a general sense of where home is?
Definitely a sense of where home is. I think I was quite confused about where home is, and that actually sort of carried on into adulthood. I think it was quite destabilizing, although it also made me quite adaptable at the same time. So it was both those things going on at the same time. When I moved to the north of England from the south, I felt like a complete fish out of water. My accent was different. I didn't want to change it. I moved at a pretty vulnerable age. I was 14 when we moved up to Scarborough. But I had to work quite hard to feel that I was fitting in. And again, as Dad was saying, you just want to be normal. Yeah. But at the same time, you want to have your sense of integrity and uniqueness as a human being. So, that was a challenging time. But I think that moving around did make me adaptable.
I'd say that's the same for you, Dad, given that you spent time in former Soviet Russia.
It's interesting because what I found when I was a sort of a young adult years was that I really enjoyed being in a different language environment, and you kind of change as a person when you're operating through a different language, and you sort of take on to some extent some characteristics of the language culture that you've adapted to. So that was an interesting experience. The way you relate to people around you and the places around you changes. So I suppose that suggests that identities can be quite fluid, especially when with language. That was another thing you got about. You kind of become aware that when you're in a country like England, regional identities are a really powerful thing.
Yeah.
And people would almost be identified by where they come from and how they talk over and above being English within that culture. So getting out of that culture into a foreign language culture gets you away from all of that. So you kind of blend in a bit more. Okay, you're a foreigner, but you don't sort of stand out for being one thing or another thing within it. Anglophone culture. It's a way out of that.
I found that it's interesting because Dad and I met in France. We didn't meet in England, and I think that was I think we both had a sense of great freedom when we were in France. And I think I agree with Dad, as speaking another language can actually free you up. It can break down barriers. So to make you feel, I don't know, somehow free as a human being. Meeting in France was quite important for us as well, because we were both feeling quite freed up in that way.
And you kind of you're not really being tied down to anything.
Exactly. We weren't tied down, and our identity and our backgrounds weren't a part of what was important in the place and time when we met.
Yeah.
So there was a great freedom in that.
Do you think that has reflected in your mutual love of travelling? Because I've been very lucky that you've both taken me and my brothers on some quite far out holidays to places that no one else really goes to, like the back ends of France and really random tiny campsites across in different parts of the country, the Isles of Scilly, La Gomera, New Zealand, but again, nowhere really touristy. Do you think that the places that you choose to go to reflect in your sense of identity and the fact that you think you're a citizen of the world, so that wherever you go, as long as you're with either yourselves or your family, nothing else really matters, as you feel at one with the place you are?
Yeah, I think you've kind of said it all for us, Joseph. With holidays and things, it's nice to be off the beaten track. You feel that you're in charge of what you're doing rather than just you going along with the tourist crowd. But also when you don't feel a connection really with the place that you're in. You feel disconnected, and it makes the experience seem rather superficial.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But you kind of need to get away from the tourist trail to feel a direct connection with the place you're in and with the people in it as well.
And also when you're off the beaten track, when you connect with the land as well, I think that...
Do you think that you get a better sense of the place that you're in a rural area?
I think there's a case for doing both. But yes, I think there is a sense of just quietly soaking up the atmosphere of a place, and it's difficult to do that in a city.
Well, also I think that when you go to a city and you stand out as a tourist, and the way the locals relate to you is as a tourist, so that they don't relate to you as you, they just put you in a box as a tourist. And even when you speak the language and you go to places in touristy areas, people are reluctant to do anything other than speak to you in English. When you go to quieter places, you can actually have a conversation with people in their language, and they don't just revert to English straight away, and that just renders the whole experience very superficial. So that's another reason for gravitating towards smaller places. I mean, there's probably also an element of cultural snobbery. That you feel that you're somebody who can really relate to the place you're going to and understand it and appreciate it more deeply.
Yeah,
so
I can understand
to an extent, you're kidding yourself because you're always a tourist and you're always an outsider, but you'd like to think that you can connect in a more meaningful way than just like your kind of stereotypical Chinese or Japanese tourists just taking photographs everywhere they go and having no kind of language connection whatsoever with the place you're in.
From their response, it's clear that banal nationalism was prevalent during their adolescence. My father automatically gravitating towards England during sporting events, and my mother presuming that the entirety of the British Isles could be referred to as England or English. Here we also see the legacy of English colonial snobbery among two very liberal, politically correct people. I'm sure that this mindless association affected the relationship between the English and Irish, Scottish and Welsh over the years, and indeed continues to do so among some people, and it's why my father grew to prefer the term British over the more loaded English. It's interesting to note that the English were oblivious to any discrimination towards the Irish, Scottish or Welsh by using the term English, even though now, certainly from the outside, it's blindingly obvious. When my father describes the power of the English regional identity, it becomes quite clear to me why they both developed a love for travelling and really immersing themselves in foreign cultures, as neither has a fixed regional identity or indeed an accent, which is a crucial part of being accepted region to region in England. Getting out of England and its fixed regional identity seems to have been the making of both of them. It influenced their choice of holiday, it really continues to do so. And I find it hard to imagine that they would have had the connection that brought them together had they met in the UK, even if they'd met at university, when you're naturally more open and accepting. I think the fact that neither of them wants to be identified as a tourist can be drawn from the fact that neither of them want to, or indeed are able to, be identified with a specific region in their home country, and that's why they've never moved back.